If you're unable to identify the different types of vulnerabilities common to most systems nowadays, you're going to have a hard time with that Security Plus exam. But the good news is we're going to talk about those coming up right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV. And today's topic du jour is all about vulnerabilities. We need to be able to understand and differentiate between the different types of vulnerabilities that are out there that we have to be prepared for as security professionals. Wes, you are here to help guide us up the mountaintop of the different types of vulnerabilities so we can answer those questions successfully on the Security Plus exam. Why don't we just start with the ground floor, work our way up to the top of that mountain? What do we mean when we say vulnerability?
All right, well, we're talking about any kind of weakness. That's essentially what a vulnerability is. Just boil it, you just distill it down, as I hear Adam say, a weakness. It's a weakness that leaves yourself open to attack. And it's important to understand, especially for the Security Plus exam and the objectives, they do call some specifics out, and that's what we want to kind of dive into here first. So, Dan, one of the first ones I think we'll dive into is more of an umbrella conversation of things like weak configurations, all right? And starting out with weak configurations, one of the first things I think of is defaults. What do you mean defaults? Well, I'm talking about any default configuration. Any system that you purchase, acquire, and you put into a production environment and you leave it set the same way you received it. All right? That, in that conversation and in that context, I will tell you, would probably say, no, I would never do that. Would never do that. You'd be surprised at how many people do that. Not only in the enterprise space, but a lot of times in the home and residential space. So defaults, right? I can tell you this guy, you're going to stand next to me when he is doing some of that, the blue team or the red team, right?
Red team.
The red team type stuff. If he turns around and he sees something that's on your network right now that's got all the defaults, you can say, well, that's easy candy for me.
Honestly, Wes, it's one of the first things I look for. If I find a login port or anything that would, or even just configuration pages that are default to whatever technology that I discover on your network, I'm going straight for that easy, low-hanging fruit. So it's unacceptable to leave that there for attackers to just come by and pick up. Don't make their job easy. If you have something that has a setting that can be changed to a more secure setting or make it different than what the default is, you absolutely should be doing that.
You'll hear security experts say due diligence. Make sure you don't do defaults. No, other things too. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to include these pretty much in the same breath because they call out weak encryption, they call out no encryption. Sometimes no encryption is just as bad as weak encryption, right? Think about wireless networks. We don't want to be using something like wired equivalent privacy, WEP, right? Very weak. And if you're using that, you definitely make it easy for the threat actors. Using unsecure protocols, using something like FTP, right? That is a clear text protocol, oldie but goodie, been around since the days of the ARPANET. But today, we need to at least be combining that with something like SSH to make sure that those file transfers aren't out there in the wild. Other things, and give some examples, HTTP versus HTTPS, FTP versus secure FTP, right? Other things like open permissions. I can tell you I have come across this where somebody couldn't figure out how to tailor down the NTFS and share permissions to a shared resource across the network. So what do? All right, I'll give NTFS permissions, full control everybody, and I'm going to go ahead and I'll give share permissions, full control everybody. All right, well, that makes it easy, but you probably heard, and if you haven't, you will hear Dan and I say this throughout this series. Convenience and security. All right, those are the scales. They don't balance out. You're going to get one or the other, and it is a balancing act. I don't know where it stops and it starts, but the more convenience you have, the less security you have.
Yeah, you see this open permissions one a lot because it's super easy to just forget that you left all these open permissions. Maybe you're doing some testing and you're just trying to make sure everything works. And then you just kind of push it off into production and you forgot that everything is wide open. And that's
right.
Probably, we see this with the Amazon S3 buckets. It's probably the big one if you're trying to grab hold of something tangible, real world kind of applications. People are making web apps. They put some information in an S3 bucket. They forget that that is open to the world. And now they're starting to put production information in there. And everybody that finds it has now got that information.
And Dan, I want to go ahead and just kind of piggyback off of that too, because that's a great comment, and it's one of the things that they call out in this section under the objectives. What's the difference between on-premise and cloud-based vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerability on-premise is, for instance, your local permissions, which can happen in the cloud as well, but Dan also gives you an example of a cloud-based vulnerability. Spinning up an S3 bucket, leaving it as the default permissions, and now all that data that you've got stored in there can be hit by anybody on the planet that's got public access to the internet. All right, so now we move into some things that we have to be aware of, and that is something known as third party, right? When we talk about third party, but before we talk about specific third party types, Dan, what do you say we just talk about some of the generic or generalized risks when it comes to implementing third party?
Yeah, and a lot of times we think, oh, we're actually like pushing risk away from us because we're using a third party. They've done all the hard stuff for us. They've found all the problems. Maybe they have, or maybe they haven't. That's really the issue that comes into play when you're bringing in third parties, because they're going to shuttle in their own risks. Hopefully you've done your due diligence. If you decided to go with a third party solution for whatever, and you figured out, oh, maybe they're susceptible to a supply chain attack, or maybe they're not doing background checks on their employees who are now having access into our system because they're working as contractors. These are things that we have to take in accounts when we work with third parties, and not just that, but their solutions that they're providing. Does their software have any issues? And this is what we mean, I guess, when we're talking third party.
Absolutely, Dan. I couldn't have said it better myself. So what are some of those risks? Let's go ahead and kind of look at a list of them, right? We talk about some lists. We talk about things like intellectual property, IP theft, right? Things like identity or credential. They do say identity theft, and they also say credential theft. Not technically one and the same, right? I can steal your user password, right? That's your credentials. But if I don't have your driver's license, social security, birth certificate, might not be able to, steal your identity. But when we talk about things like compliance, right? You have to worry about those compliance issues, especially when you're talking about PII, right? Network intrusion, right? Do you have things like intersite agreements that are established when you connect two networks together? Maybe you've got a bank, you've got a mortgage company who wants to go and connect to a bank and figure out what are the mortgages that we want to buy. Well, you have to have some kind of intersite agreement on how you're going to connect, right? Or you could have things like network intrusion. You could have reputation damage, right? Let's think about how Target's reputation was damaged by an attack against a HAVAC system that was third-party contract a few years ago, and they lost a lot of internal personal identifiable information. It was a big thing, right? So reputation damage, things like vendor support. All right. Do you have vendor support thoroughly documented when you are dealing with third parties, right? So definitely,
like having the world catch fire and you go, how do I fix this?
I'm not sure.
Seems hard.
Call Jimmy in the
we don't support that.
downstairs with a red stapler, right?
And as someone who's worked on workstation support, and
sure,
done tier 1 type of triage, a lot of vendors will just try to push the blame off to, well, no, that's the hardware, that's the problem. Oh, it's your browser that's an issue. It's not our software. So be prepared for that type of pushback. And if you're not, you could have yourself a bad time if the world does catch fire.
That's right.
You got to put something out.
I was going to say, because GDPR violations, and they're still going to point back to you if you are in part of that supply chain, whether it's third party or it's your company in general. Other risks that we look at risks to data, right? What is that? Where is it being stored? Is it being stored on your networks? If you cross international boundaries, whose jurisdiction is it, right? It's easy to do that in cloud today. That it might not be sitting in it might be sitting on, foreign shores, right? Again, not only that, things like data loss and leakage, things like theft, just outright theft of your information. And again, we've kind of touched on, cloud-based examples. Dan gave the S3 bucket being orphaned, maybe stored data in there and you leave it, you don't even know that it's there anymore, right? On-premise. That's right.
They love to be insecure.
Containers are so much fun. They help.
There's that easy versus security thing.
Right.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, that's right. And then on-premise, we talk about things like open permissions, right? That's something that's going to be that in-house we can fix. And that's just one example. There are other types of examples. Now, let's talk about some of the issues that we face, in general, right? Some of the issues we face are things like, a damage to vendor reputation, right? We talk about vendor management, right? They have structured organizations that when you are going to use third-party vendors, right? They are going to help manage this part and some of these issues that can come up with vendor management. We've kind of already mentioned it with reputation damage, right? Lack of visibility, not clear documentation into what their processes is. So if I am a supplier of Dan's company, Dan has a security policy that is thoroughly laid out and they're doing all of their due diligence, but I miss one thing as a supplier to his company on my side, well, that's going to be my reputation. But since we're kind of holistically joined at the hip here in this process, it's also going to affect his reputation as well. Things like compliance risk, right? If you have vendors that are managing other portions of whatever product it is that you're providing, are they in compliance? I don't know.
You should probably know that.
You should probably know that, right? There's things like NDAs. However, this isn't all bad. All right, it's good. There are benefits, right? There are things like, this is a typo, a vendor screen. No, that's vendor screening is what that should say. Vendor screening, thorough documentation. We talk about risk, transference of that risk to that team that is going to do vendor management on your behalf. You get thorough documentation. And they also assume some of the risk that's part of that. Things like compliance monitoring. If you are somebody, which if you're online today, you pretty much fall under things like GDPR and stuff and privacy concerns, right? Making sure that compliance is completely monitored. So vendor management is something that's important, and it is an important process. I definitely would encourage you to see some of the organizations out there that are do this so that you can see some of their documentation.
Yeah, this is where all the boring stuff comes in. Wes mentioned NDAs, very important. SLAs, right? Service level agreements, statements of work, scopes, all that stuff needs to go and be actually really looked at and make sure it's with a fine-tooth comb gone over so that there are no surprises. It's nice to be able to transfer that risk off to a vendor or a third party, but you got to remember there is a risk associated with that as well. You got to make sure everybody's going to pull their weight and mow their half of the lawn. So just be aware of that. All right, let's talk about third-party systems integration, right? This isn't just the fact that maybe they've got a system that you need and you don't want to reinvent the wheel, so you just want to kind of bring it in, bolt it on, and we all work happily ever after. At least that's the idea.
We hope so, absolutely. You know, when we talk about systems integration, we're talking about exactly that. Somebody else has a platform that we want to integrate. Now, maybe you haven't been aware of where this is, you're already using this, and maybe you don't realize it. Ever log into an app on your phone that says log in with Facebook or log in with Google? Well, that's some kind of OAuth, and I'm not sure exactly the protocols that they're doing, but that's some kind of secure federation that you're going to integrate with your company, and you're going to have to get with their documentation, their APIs, and find out their information in order to connect these two services together. So examples, we have things like social media. You guys and gals out there are familiar with social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, things like delivery systems, right? Maybe you're integrating with delivery systems such as UPS, USPS. I put DHL in there just to kind of be fair to UPS and FedEx, not include them, but delivery systems likewise. Things like payment systems. You've probably seen these. Are you integrating with PayPal? Are you integrating with Apple Pay? Are you integrating with Google Wallet, right? Now we're talking financial data that you're integrating. Remember, it's your company, it's your reputation. Have they been integrated and have they gone through the proper vetting process? So this is an example where systems integrations, the examples of types of systems integration with as well as some things that you should be aware of.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that as we're walking down the third-party lane, we might as well go ahead and bring up the idea of outsourcing development, right? That it's not your in-house team that might be developing certain things, or maybe they're working on the core, but you just don't have enough manpower to get to the tertiary items, but are still important. Maybe you bring that third party in to kind of fill that gap in, but risks still associated there as well.
That's right. So some of the challenges we have to worry about, are things like code quality, right? Code quality and protection. Things like, again, compliance risks, right? If you're outsourcing that code, you're still going to be using it in your system. You still have a requirement, well, potentially, I guess. I can't say it's all encompassing, to make sure that these things meet quality, meet compliance, right? We have things like non-disclosure agreements, right? How is that company doing their software development lifecycle? Are they using or implementing secure coding practices, right? So these are some of the challenges that you need to be aware of and some of the things that you're faced when you're outsourcing things like your code.
All right. When it comes to vulnerabilities, a lot of times these things could have been avoided if only our organization was performing some good utilitied patch management, updating. But a lot of times, unfortunately, that is just not happening, and that can cause, well, you just open the door and say, hey there, bad actors. Why don't you just come on in, say hi, put your feet up, enjoy a drink from the fridge. Unfortunately, this is far too often happening. Wes, tell us about how we can avoid this through patch management.
Absolutely. Patch management, right? The systematic approach to applying patches on your systems to ensure stability, performance, and uptime, right? And as well to secure up security vulnerabilities, right? We have 3 different things that we need to be aware of. We need to update our firmware, all right? Security vulnerabilities happen all the time and are exploited because of outdated firmware. Things like your operating systems, right? And it doesn't matter if you're in the Windows environment, you're in the Linux, the Mac, or the Unix environment, you need to make sure that security patches are applied. If they're not, they leave you open to attack. And the same thing happens, can be said about software and applications. There's a reason they update software to make sure that not only is it stable, it performs the way it should be, but also to close up any of those weaknesses that could leave you open to attack.
Yeah, and this isn't just for the operating systems as well. Don't forget those third-party applications that you might be running. This is the flashes of the world, like the Adobe type of suites. Maybe you're running some sort of virtualization or connectivity software. All sorts of stuff. They need to be updated as well. It's not just your operating system, right?
That's right. Yeah, so just remember, so the 3 that we need to be aware of, we need to be aware of firmware, operating system, and applications as well.
Yeah, Wes, we do tend to hang on to old stuff because we know that it works, but unfortunately, if we're not updating them, we're leaving ourselves open, and that applies to not only operating systems, but software, or maybe even a system itself, like more of a tangible system, something physical. These are things that we have to maintain as well, thinking the idea of legacy stuff, right?
Absolutely. Legacy systems can get you in trouble, right? They can be beneficial to your company, especially if your company's invested a lot of money in them. We could definitely see where you want to keep those, you get your ROI, right? Your return on investment. But here's the problem with legacy systems. When it comes down to it, lack of vendor support. Now, I just generically said lack of vendor support. What does that mean a lot of times? It means lack of patching. If security vulnerabilities or weaknesses are found, they're not going to be updating it, right? It's past its shelf life. We see that operating systems is something. We see things like XP and Windows 7 machines still out there on the network, unpatched Windows 10 machines out there on the network. People running software that's 10, 15 years old, hasn't been supported in a very long time. This leaves you open to attack as well, especially because it can just boil down to a simple Google search. If we know that information, or you're using these systems, simple Google search, and I can find all the vulnerabilities that are associated with that app, and now I kind of know this is where my attack vector is going to be.
I feel like you could have had a third point under there that's just lack of vendor. Because
lack of
a lot of vendors
good.
go out
right.
of business, and
That's right.
You bought their software, your business runs on top of it. Now what do I do?
It's one of the reasons we talk about code refactoring, right? A lot of times code refactoring can be done because there is no longer support. You still want to get the same functionality, but you want to clean up the code and maybe identify bugs on your own.
That's right. All right, this is the last thing we've got for today, which is going to be the 0 days. Probably my favorite thing, just because these are the really smart people out there that are finding the issues and exploiting them. And although there's not a lot we can do about it until it becomes known, we do need to be at least acknowledge the fact that this is something that happens. Tell us more about 0 days, if you would, Wes.
Sure, absolutely. So 0 days are when your system, if they find a 0-day exploit, your system is the most vulnerable, all right? And that's a lot of times because there's no vendor awareness, all right? Now, even when there is vendor awareness, that doesn't mean you're safe and secure. Just because the vendor is aware doesn't mean that patches are available to it, right? A lot of times you'll have things like bug bounties. You know, these white hats will find these exploits, and what they'll do is they'll contact the vendor and they'll say, hey, we found something that's out there in the wild, and we want to let you know to give you time to produce a patch and then release it to the wild. All right, but even that doesn't protect you from a 0-day virus, right? Or a 0-day vulnerability. Why is that? Because until you apply the patch, you're not protected. So again, just remember 0 days are things that aren't known by the vendors, and it's when you're most vulnerable because there is no vendor awareness, and a lot of times there are no patches or fixes for what could potentially be an exploitation of this type of weakness.
Yeah, actually, it is defined by a 0 day because it is there are no patches for it. It has been 0 days since they released a patch. And it's no good for you. But we've gone over a lot of vulnerabilities in today's episode, so make sure you go back over those, understand the differences between things like third-party weaknesses versus just general like patch management issues, as well as 0 days, obviously a big deal for all of us. So we got to be aware of those and put them in the proper categories. That being said, thanks so much, Wes, and thank you for watching. We're out of time for this episode. More to come in the Security Plus series, so be on the lookout for that. Until then, have yourself a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.